Yeah, I'm stoked you could be here today. So let's jump in with a very broad question. What does the ideal home audio setup look like to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. We get asked that all the time. I think it's sort of it's pretty broad. So we usually will start with it's kind of like somebody going, "Hey, what's the best car?" And you know, we usually will try and back it up, and we'll kind of take a step back and say, "Who are we talking to? Why are they here? Why are they even asking this question?" And to so that the answer we'll give to somebody with a family with maybe three or four kids in the house versus somebody looking to furnish um, their cool loft in Brooklyn might be a completely different answer. And then it also really has a lot to do with their own personal preferences. So we'll ask a lot of leading questions like, so are you into music? Are you into TV? You into like what when somebody says, "Hey, what's the ideal sound setup look like?" I'll say, like, "Well, let's talk about you a little bit. Like, you go to concerts, you watch TV a lot, you watch movies. Like, what's your idea of relaxation and how does sound kind of play into that? Are you somebody that has music going everywhere?" Sometimes we'll ask them about their car, like what what kind of sound setup do you have in your car? And if somebody goes, "Oh, well, I don't know, I just bought the basic thing," that'll tell us a lot about the guidance. Like I noticed your last panel, you had the Genelec the Genelec folks on, right? We're going to steer clear of conversations about super high end with folks who aren't necessarily going to appreciate that. But if they open the door and they'll say something like, "Oh yeah, I just to me, bad sound is is a criminal, is a crime," or they'll speak about sound almost with very emotional language and because sound as like smell, right? It's very evocative, right? It's just it it takes us back. It reminds us of experiences that we've had. It's the soundtrack. So let's just take somebody building a home, for example, and assume that they maybe have a family, with some kids in the home. Um, we'll always kind of back in this by saying, "Hey, complexity is the enemy of any of this being successful." So we'll really lean into the idea that, hey, this really needs to be a simple solution, and we'll ask them, "Hey, what kind of experience do you have, using like a smartphone, or how much of your music is on physical media, or how much do you like streaming?" And so if we can back into a solution that is pretty close to a tool they're already using. Maybe if they, for example, we're never going to recommend voice control to somebody who's never used a voice assistant before. We're never going to recommend a smart home heavy or smartphone heavy solution to somebody who's kind of a uh, self-proclaimed luddite. So what usability really has to come first and foremost. And so for that, again, depending on what we hear, that guides us towards, okay, well, maybe if you're used to using iTunes, then here's a solution that looks a lot like that. If your kids are used to using Spotify, here's a solution that might look a lot like that. And from there, having it be as flexible as possible. So I'll give you a couple of good examples. I mean, obviously, Sonos dominates the market in terms of multi-room audio, and I think for good reason. They've had a good track record of providing, I think, up until maybe May of 2024, anyway, a pretty good suite of products that were pretty simple and easy to use with streaming services, and with allowing you to do things like AirPlay into the system, and that could be a wireless speaker, it could be an amplifier, and that could be speakers that are sitting out on the counter, or installed in the ceiling. Very flexible, very simple, very easy to use. And there's a bunch of manufacturers just like that at all these different price points. But I feel like I gave you kind of a long-winded answer to a simple question, but unfortunately, it really all depends on who we're talking to. But that maybe gives a little insight into how we as home technology designers sort of approach it. It's all about who we're talking to.
You hit on some really interesting points, one of which being like people like their sound differently and you like to ask them how much they know about it. I like the car question because that's so true. I do happen to know who makes a sound system in my car, but like not something I, wanted or was like specified. It just came with the car. And then like my parents, if I go to their house, their sound, I install the sound bar for them, but the sound bar is more because they listen to TV at volume 1000.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't care as long as they could hear it loudly. And we are working on getting Matt on. But let's jump into some of our other questions. Let's start with the first one. Wireless everything is very popular, but wires obviously still serve a place in AV technology. How can integrators effectively balance wired and wireless audio systems in a smart home setup?
Yeah, it's a great question too. I think to some extent, the newer systems that have come online in the last, 10 years or more, there's been a huge effort in educating the market into what multi-room audio means. But I think the education maybe hasn't been quite what we'd hoped. So now we almost find ourselves fighting a battle of when somebody thinks of a multi-room audio system right now, they automatically think, oh, that's putting a speaker on the countertop. And so I almost feel like we have to re-educate people into helping them understand that no, we can hide all of this. Like the technology should not be visible. It should be heard. and so every room should have sort of eyes and ears, and the ears of the speaker. So how do we want those speakers to blend in? Do we want to have them in ceiling? Do we want to have them in wall? Do we want to have them visible? Do we want to have them invisible? And so I think a lot of times we're maybe re-educating folks because, well, oftentimes they'll say something like, well, all the wired stuff is gone, right? You guys don't even have jobs anymore. I'll say, well, actually, a lot of times we're working with interior decorators or other specifiers, and they very much do want to hide the technology. And so what we find ourselves doing is explaining that you can take a multi-room audio system like a Sonos or like Blue OS or some of these other products that are out there, and you can create a hybrid approach where some of those rooms might be wired. Some of them might be wireless. You might have a little doodad that you pick up and carry into the backyard. You might have installed speakers. And so I think a lot of the time and effort we spend is taking kind of a yes and approach to some of the mass media messaging that they might have seen. The same way they might feel like ADT is the best home security system or Sonos is the best audio system, and explaining to them that can be blended and extended into a luxury residential setting where they don't see anything in it, and it's beautiful and it's elegant.
Matt, I'm so glad we got the technical issue solved and got you on.
We'll blame it on Canada.
Can you give us a little quick intro about yourself?
Sure. My name is Matt D. Scott. I own Omega Audio Video. I've owned that company for, 22 years, I believe now. 23 years. We work in residential, commercial, and specifically have worship in Canada. And happy to be here.
Yay. So Henry and I were just talking about the popularity of wireless, but how wired still plays a role and how you can effectively balance those advantages, disadvantages. So let's hear your answer.
Well, Henry had some great points. And I think the biggest thing to keep in mind, to kind of echo his point a little bit, is customers are looking for the flexibility of wireless. They don't necessarily care how you get there. they just want to know that they have some flexibility in their systems. So that could mean, again, that you're going to have a mostly wired system with one or two devices that they can move around as needed, depending on what they want to do. But the biggest thing that we have to talk about anytime a customer brings up wireless is what their wireless backbone is to support that. Because everyone loves the idea of taking that speaker out onto the deck. What they don't like is when it pauses or jumps or skips, or they can't get it to the hot tub because their wireless network isn't far enough. No one really thinks that through when they do the conversation with an integrator of like, well, I can just do wireless for everything. It becomes a bigger part of the conversation of, yes, you can do wireless, but there are some things to keep in mind as you do that. And then the last thing that has to come up anytime you have that conversation is the aesthetic of wireless. Because to most customers, when they think wireless, they truly think wireless. They don't think of the fact that you're going to have to plug 98%, Henry, of those speakers in. Because yes, they're wireless for connectivity, but they are not wireless for power. So you can have wireless, but how are you putting those wireless speakers behind your couch on that lovely, little nested table you have behind the couch that floats in the middle of your living room when there's no power? It just becomes a much bigger conversation.
I like when you talked about the, it doesn't reach everywhere. It's like internet. Like your internet only goes so far into the yard, and people think audio is somehow more magical than that. So,
well, the problem is that they don't connect the two.
Yeah.
Right. They don't connect the fact that their phone doesn't work in the hot tub.
Yeah. Not only do they not connect the two, but no matter what, we as home technology pros are held accountable to all of it. So to Matt's point, leading with,
oh yeah, it's our fault.
Oh, absolutely. So like those of us who don't lead with the network and talk about, hey, you know what, right now, all of your stuff is running on this sort of dirt road and it's super congested and it's got a lot of potholes in it. What we need to do is actually kind of repave, and we need to build four to 6 lanes of super highway here. Now, we're not going to run traffic on 2 or 3 of these lanes for now, but we've got headroom for the future. And so by taking a step back, and that also I think helps build trust, because we're taking a few steps back to take a step forward, and it kind of sets the table for the rest of the conversation. Because to Matt's point, I mean, every last stitch of this stuff, whether it's audio, lighting, security, you name it, it all sits on that network. So those of us who don't take that into account do so at our own peril.
So switching gears a little bit, can you share some best practices for mitigating signal interference, and how do you ensure reliable audio performance when homes have multiple connected devices?
Are we talking just wireless? Or are we talking in general?
General.
Well, the biggest thing to keep in mind anytime you're talking about interference and signal degradation is what causes those things, right? And that's typically power is going to be your number one thing, right? Power and range. So whether it is range of that speaker wire that is running 500 feet out to some outbuilding that they must have on the same system, to a wireless speaker that they want to put in line with a microwave from your router, right? All of those things are going to come into play. So the biggest thing, like really the foundational principles of what we do, is you've got to show up, you've got to have a good understanding of what the client is looking for, and then take the time to do a site survey to figure out what's going on. Do you have a rack full of equipment that's underpowered, sitting in the basement, that does not have enough power to handle the load that you're trying to drive through that system, right? Is it something where, again, they have a ton of wireless devices and they have an unmanaged wireless network where not only is it undersized and maybe underserved, to Henry's point, but also maybe they're in an MDU situation where there's a lot of competing things on the network and in the air, and you're not taking that into account. So it again comes back to the basics of, you need to do that site survey. You need to have an understanding of the location in which you're putting products and solutions in to understand the best way to get there, because there are some obviously principles that get us there, but you kind of have to deal with it on a case by case basis to make sure that if something's funky, you're not missing it.
And to Matt's point too, there are tools that we will use to sniff out wireless interference. There are devices like a pretty popular one in our space called the Y-Spy, and it'll sniff out different spectrum and figure out if you have any crosstalk. And then, to Matt's point as well, which interference are we talking about? You've got kind of some of the kind of shorter wave radio stuff from Bluetooth interference, Bluetooth low energy. You've got Wi-Fi. Now you've got kind of all of these different flavors of Wi-Fi now in the air. So you've got WiMAX from the not just the 5G, but the WiMAX now being put out by some of the providers in urban areas. You've got 5G. You've got Wi-Fi 7. You have 6. You have 6E6. You have anyway on down, and more often than not, they're actually standards that haven't even been ratified. So they're manufacturers that have made gear that is kind of close to what the IEEE agreed to. Then high and low voltage, to Matt's point, it is not uncommon to see a rack where you have a beautifully dressed rack and it's Velcro tied together and it's so beautiful, but it's whoever did it take the power supply and the unshielded
everything together
cabling and tied them all together, and they're wondering why there's huge performance issues. So unshielded cabling together with high voltage cabling is bad news, and I think a lot of it goes unnoticed, and it's sometimes you'll see jobs that get diagnosed as equipment or other things or heat or something else. In reality, it's interference issues. So I think the more scientifically we approach those, the better. But unfortunately, more often than not, there's a lot more of a swag or wag method that's used in the field.
Well, and there's even situations where a random one that I'm thinking of is we had a client who had a tenant, and the tenant was on their network, and they never understood why from the time the tenant got home, all of a sudden their whole network just got slammed, and the tenant was mining Bitcoin, which they were not aware of. And all of a sudden, and they didn't connect the two because the tenant came and went at their convenience, right? And all of a sudden their audio quality and their video quality of all of their streaming devices just got hammered. And it took forever for us to show up because we're not there when when that tenant got home after work. It took forever for us to figure out that, here's where, again, quote unquote interference on that network was this kid mining Bitcoin in the basement that nobody knew was happening. So you really have to take all factors into account and, document when and how you're doing all of those testing so that if there persists to be an issue, you can easily narrow what may be causing that, because it could be outside of your control.
So when you're scaling audio systems for larger homes or even to outdoor areas, what challenges do you think integrators should be aware of, and how can they avoid those challenges?
I see a lot of attempts at trying to take typical 8-ohm speaker systems and extend them into commercial applications when really they should be 70-volt systems, where you have impedance challenges with the speakers, where a 4-room system or a 6-room system or a typical 8-ohm approach that you might use in residential, all of a sudden now you're trying to extend that out to a larger application where, again, there's a lack of understanding, I think, in the residential world that impacts large scale residential jobs, because really they're commercial for them. They're in terms of the approach. We need to be looking at them using more of a commercial mindset. I mean, anywhere where there's these large homes that have huge chillers and things like that, that requires more of a commercial mindset. So I'll see like a lot of malpractice in using residential techniques where really commercial techniques should be employed. And then documentation is probably another one where failure on paper and designing it here and failing here on paper first is a heck of a lot easier than down the road figuring out you got a problem in the field and there's amplifiers that have smoke that not being kept inside the amplifier. But that's just a little bit. I mean, Matt's forgotten more about this stuff than I'll ever do.
Well, there's so many situations where scaling is the problem, right? There are a massive number of residential products that do fine in a small home, a large home, a gigantic home. They just need to be scaled appropriately. So to Henry's point, we've all seen, the single zone player that is feeding 16 rooms and they're cascading impedance matching speaker selectors because either the integrator was not adept enough to understand that, or the client was respectfully too cheap to buy the proper system or scale the system appropriately to do that. To Henry's point, especially in large scale luxury situations, you have to take a commercial approach to almost all aspects of that, because the network needs to be commercial grade. The audio system typically needs to be commercial grade just due to scale. And it's not so much that it's a quality issue. It is a scalability issue. They're designed to do that. We're seeing more and more true commercial products in residential situations because it's honestly more cost effective with the same performance level as multiple residential systems scaled up to do that, right? Video distribution is a really good point.
Yeah.
You can't do, or it is way more cost effective to do a proper AV over IP commercial grade system to do 16 endpoints of video than it is to do that with a traditional residential HDMI matrix. Can you do it? Yeah. Is it effective and a good investment? No. And I think that's where, we see this in both residential and commercial. When projects get beyond your normal scale, right? I'm not advocating for you to not take that job. Take the job, try and make the money. But let's be a little bit more aware of where our skills are. If it's beyond what you normally do, call a friend, somebody who plays in that space. Either hire them as a consultant or bring them on to do some of it as a sub. Stop, overextending yourselves, because that's where you get into trouble and you end up with a client who is unhappy, and more importantly, a client who may be willing to have you meet their lawyers to solve that problem, and none of us want that.
And to Matt's point too, like saying I don't know seems to be, a lot of us seem to have a hard time with that.
We're allergic to that word.
Yeah, I say it over and over all day, every day. I don't know, but I know who does. And
yeah,
I feel like saying, just us giving ourselves in the moment permission with the end customer, with the client. Hey, that's a great question. I'm gonna add that to our commitment list.
We'll get back to you. We'll get back to you.
Maybe you don't know. If you're like me, you don't. Maybe, and you say, "Hey, that's a great question. I'm gonna document that, and we're just gonna add that to our commitment list. We're going to send a recap with smart commitments about what's going on next and when. I mean, what I just said made me sound like I sort of knew what was going on, even though I could have made a list of 10 things. They had no idea what was going on. But to what Matt said about the commercials backing into residential, it made me think about this year's CEDIA. Dante actually had a big presence. And for most residential folks, they're not really tuned in to the Dante protocol and what it can do in terms of scaling audio, throughout their product, right? And so I feel like that is something that, as you said that, Matt, it just kind of light bulb went on. But I feel like that's probably the path forward, is not sort of, Resi reinventing the wheel. It's Resi adopting well-worn solutions that have been thriving in the Avixa space for a good while.
Well, and I don't want to jump the gun, Megan, but
No, go ahead.
Dante is the big, it is the big bad wolf that is coming into the industry, albeit quite slowly. But man, there are so many things that you can do with Dante, especially in large environments, that is phenomenal and makes our lives so much easier. And I remember talking about this, 3-4 years ago with some integrators I knew, and they're like, yeah, we're never doing that. We're just like, we can run speaker wire. It's fine. I'm like, no. Like, you have a cable there, you can use it and get everything there and just be done. Yeah. And there are so many technologies that some are new, some are not new, some are new to you, but they are allowing us to do such greater systems and much more flexible and honestly reliable systems with some of these new technologies that are coming. And again, they've been in typically commercial for quite a while, but they are just slowly making inroads into residential. And honestly, you can compare it to networking. For years, we did not care about networking in the Resi space. We left it to the ISPs and took it from there. And now you're seeing all of these, big commercial and true IT companies that are playing in networking, and they have pushed politely a lot of the residential specific retailers or manufacturers kind of out of that space, because their knowledge base and their depth as a manufacturer is so much deeper and so much broader, and they give you so many better solutions. And we're going to see that with stuff like Dante as that comes down the pipe more and more.
That's a perfect segue into my last question.
You're welcome.
Ahead, what trends or innovations in home audio should integrators keep an eye on? And Henry, we'll start with you, since Matt kind of gave us a sneak peek into his thoughts.
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, clearly beyond Dante and stability, I'd call Dante stability, right? Like, one of my mentors used to have a really good aphorism and said, hey, technology really shines when it gets out of the way. And so as we think about the future of audio, right, we're less talking about the shiny object piece and more about it seems like quality has started to matter again. And I feel like we've gone through in the last 4 or 5 years a little bit of a renaissance in terms of quality mattering. And you can lay that at the feet of maybe because broadband got better, maybe because the pandemic and people started to hear the difference, maybe because Apple started pushing lossless audio and Apple Music, even though you can't listen to it on a lot of devices. And maybe it's Tidal and Jay-Z promoting MQA content, whatever it is, but quality is starting to matter. So people, when you hear amazing sound, you cannot you can't unhear it. And so I feel like because of that, quality has started to matter again with audio, because it used to be about ubiquity of sound, right? Oh, I can hear any song on earth. Well, now it's like, well, I mean, we're almost back into the 1980s where it's like, well, what it was this, the CD was recorded and mastered and on the same equipment. So I think that's starting to matter. I mean, even just behind me, like why else would I have 6 foot tall speakers in my office? I mean, other than I guess I do this for a living, but why else would I have a piece of gear behind me that preserves the signal? So I think signal preservation, I think protocols like Dante will make this stuff much more reliable. The music that's getting created now is fantastic, and not just for bands, but for soundtracks, for movies, entertainment. Some of the demos that I saw at CD this year were just mind blowing. So those are kind of my 2 or 3 of where we're heading. But I'd love to hear what Matt has to say.
Thank you, sir. Such a nice intro. Dante, I think, is going to be the big game changer. And once we see that, the same way we started to and continue to kind of see HD-based get installed on displays so that you can, there's not a ton that do it, but there are some. So you can just plug that network cable in, and as long as you've got a some form of transmitter that's doing HD-based, you can get that to your display. Dante's going to be the same. As we continue to see some speakers come out that have Dante built in, and you can literally just plug them in, stuff like that from a transmission and a flexibility is going to be huge. I think the other thing that's going to come into play is we're seeing high quality speaker components from manufacturers that you wouldn't always necessarily think of. And I'm not going to promote per se, but some of the stuff that Sonos is doing with their new Arc, that they're using brand new subwoofer tech that we've never seen. It's not a paper cone. It's a flat from an acquisition of Mayhite, I believe. They're doing spatial audio. So you now have Apple headphones and you have the Sonos Ultra that has 9.4.1 spatial regs. So you're seeing this significant increase in codecs and formats at price points that are obtainable for the average consumer. So just like Henry said with, kind of HD or MQA audio, again, you're seeing that from companies that typically were out of reach of the average consumer. That's no longer the case. You can go get a soundbar that does spatial. So as the producers of both music and video content really start to lean into that, we're going beyond Atmos. And I don't think we're going to skip over Atmos per se, but you're getting into something that is different. And that's going to change a lot of the approaches, and it's going to change a lot of the applications, right? I think the listening rooms are still kind of there, maybe not that big of a deal. But as more content is available in MQA, that may become a bigger thing. But there's a lot changing right now in high res and in audio aficionados. It'll be interesting to see where it goes and how some of the manufacturers leverage that desire to hopefully bring out some products that people like and want to buy.
And
specifically from me.
Okay, now really on that note,
And Henry.
For me,
we are out of time. I want to thank you both so much for joining me. This was a fantastic convo. Henry, if people want to learn more about you or connect with you, where can they find that information?
absolutely. Thanks for having me on the socials, etc. at Get Livewire. Thanks again for having me today.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. What about you?
You can find me on most socials at Matt D. Scott or Omega Audio Video or on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you.